The dust settled around the Land Rover, choking the already thick hot air of the savannah. The silence that followed the engine cutting out was heavier than the heat. 500 pounds of muscle, claw, and instinct stood 50 yards away. His mane was dark and thick, a crown showing he was in the prime of his life. He wasn't just a lion, he was a king of this territory. And 5 years in the wild changes everything. "Sarah, stay close to the vehicle," David, the reserve manager, whispered, his hand instinctively resting near the rifle bolt. His voice was tight. He'd seen what happens when humans misjudge the distance between domestic affection and wild reality. "He's wild now, don't forget that. He isn't the cub you bottle-fed." Sarah ignored him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a mixture of adrenaline and a deep, aching hope. She opened the heavy door and stepped onto the cracked earth. The lion's head snapped toward the sound. His amber eyes, fierce and unreadable, locked onto her. He let out a low guttural chuff that vibrated through the ground and up through the soles of her boots. Then he moved. It wasn't a casual walk. It was a stalk that quickly accelerated into a full run. The sheer power of his movement kicked up clouds of red dust. David shouted something behind her, but Sarah didn't flinch. She just stood there, vulnerable and small against the oncoming force of nature, whispering a single name into the wind as the massive predator closed the final gap between them. The impact was seconds away. 5 years is a lifetime in the wild. It is enough time for empires to rise and fall in the animal kingdom, enough time for memory to fade into instinct. As the ground shook beneath Sarah's feet, her mind flashed back to the beginning. It wasn't a majestic encounter. She had found him shivering in a culvert during a monsoon downpour, a scrawny, dehydrated ball of tawny fur no bigger than a house cat. His mother had been taken by poachers, and his littermates hadn't survived the night. He was the runt, the one destined to die. Sarah, a volunteer at the sanctuary back then, hadn't slept for 3 days. She had bottle-fed him a mixture of milk and vitamins every 2 hours, cleaning him, warming him with her own body heat when the generator failed. She named him Apollo, not because he was strong, but because she hoped he would grow into the name. For 18 months, they were inseparable. He didn't just tolerate her, he sought her out. He would drape his growing body over her lap while she read field reports, his purr sounding like a diesel engine. But nature has rules. As his mane began to darken and his playful swipes started leaving deep bruises, David had intervened. "He belongs to the bush, Sarah," David had told her the day they loaded the transport crate. "If you love him, you have to let him go, and you have to accept that once he goes, he never truly comes back." She had accepted it. She had let him go into the protected reserve, watching through tears as he disappeared into the tall grass without looking back. Now, staring at the predator barreling toward her, David's warning echoed in her ears. The animal rushing at her wasn't the clumsy cub who chewed on her bootlaces. This was a wild apex predator, tested by drought, territory wars, and survival. Sarah closed her eyes, bracing for the collision, praying that somewhere behind those wild amber eyes, the boy she raised still existed. The months following Apollo's release were the hardest of Sarah's life. The sanctuary was full of other animals needing care, injured rhinos, orphaned cheetahs, but the silence in her small cabin was deafening. Apollo's empty sleeping mat was a constant reminder of the void he had left. She tried to keep track of him through David. David was the pragmatist to Sarah's idealist. He saw the reserve as a complex, often brutal ecosystem that needed management, not romance. He would provide her with dry, clipped reports. Sighted near the watering hole. Appears healthy, keeping his distance from the resident pride. For the first year, the news was good. Apollo was surviving. He was learning to hunt, starting with small game and working his way up to impalas. Sarah felt a swell of pride mixed with a sharp pang of loss. He was doing it. He was becoming the king she had named him to be. But then the reports stopped. A severe drought hit the region in the second year. The waterholes dried up into cracked mud pits. The herbivores migrated, and the predators turned on each other. David's team was stretched thin, dealing with poaching incursions and starving elephants. "David, where is he?" Sarah had demanded one evening, cornering him in the operations tent. "I haven't heard anything in 3 months." David looked exhausted, his face covered in grime. "Sarah, we have bigger problems than one lion. The trackers haven't found his spoor, the territory he was patrolling. It's been taken over by a coalition of 3 males from the north. They're aggressive." The implication hung heavy in the hot air. A lone young male against a coalition didn't stand a chance. "You think he's dead?" Sarah whispered. David didn't sugarcoat it. "In this drought, it's the most likely outcome. He was alone. Nature is efficient, Sarah. You know this." She didn't want to know it. For the next 2 years, Sarah threw herself into her work with a manic energy, trying to outrun the grief. She convinced herself that if he were dead, they would have found something. A carcass, a collar. The lack of proof became her only lifeline. She clung to the irrational hope that he was out there, smart enough to hide, strong enough to endure. The boy who had survived the monsoon in a culvert wouldn't give up that easily. 5 years after that first rainy night in the culvert, the radio in the operations center crackled to life. It was a routine anti-poaching patrol drone sweeping the northern sector, an area known as the Ghostlands because of its rugged, unforgiving terrain and lack of water. David was staring at the monitor, his coffee mug frozen halfway to his mouth. "Sarah," he called out, his voice different. It wasn't the clipped tone of a manager. It was soft, hesitant. Sarah walked over, expecting bad news. She looked at the grainy, high-contrast feed transmitted from the drone. On the screen, amidst the rocky outcrops, lay a lion. He was massive, his mane a thick, dark tapestry that extended well past his shoulders, indicating a mature, dominant male. He was resting, licking a paw. "It's a big male," Sarah said, shrugging. "So?" "Look at the left flank," David said, zooming in. The image pixelated, but the mark was undeniable. A jagged line of white fur against the tawny gold. A scar. Sarah stopped breathing. When Apollo was 6 months old, he had tried to jump a wire fence to chase a butterfly and cut his side. She had stitched that wound herself, her hands shaking, while he slept under anesthesia. "It's him," she whispered. The realization hit her like a physical blow. "He's alive." "He's alive," David agreed. "But look at him, Sarah. He's huge, he's scarred, he's survived in the Ghostlands alone for years. That isn't a pet, that's a survivor." They didn't argue this time. They packed the Land Rover in silence. The drive took 4 hours, navigating dry riverbeds and pushing through thorn bushes that screeched against the metal paint. As they got closer to the coordinates, the air grew heavy. The landscape here was wilder, ancient. They found him near a rocky kopje, resting in the shade. David killed the engine. They were 50 yards away. The lion didn't run. He stood up slowly, rippling with muscle. He was far bigger than Sarah remembered, a warrior king wearing the scars of his battles. He looked at the car, his gaze intense and predatory. "He doesn't know us," David said quietly, his hand hovering near the ignition key, ready to flee. "To him, we're just intruders." Sarah's hand touched the door handle. "He knows," she said, though her voice trembled. "He has to." She pushed the door open. The metallic click echoed across the clearing. The lion's ears twitched. He turned his massive head, and for the first time in 5 years, Sarah looked directly into the eyes of the boy she had raised. The gap closed in seconds. To David, watching through the dusty windshield, it looked like a suicide. A 400-pound apex predator launching himself at a woman who stood barely 5'5". "Sarah, get down!" David screamed, his hand fumbling for the door handle, abandoning the rifle. But it was too late. Apollo didn't slow down. He didn't hesitate. He launched himself into the air, his massive front paws outstretched. Sarah braced herself, closing her eyes, throwing her arms wide open in a gesture of absolute, terrifying surrender. The impact knocked the wind out of her. It wasn't a tackle, it was an embrace. The sheer weight of the lion forced Sarah backward, her boots sliding in the red dirt, but she didn't fall. Apollo wrapped his massive forelegs around her shoulders, burying his face into the crook of her neck. He wasn't biting. He was making a sound that defied description, a mixture of a high-pitched whine and a deep rumbling purr that rattled Sarah's chest cavity. You remember, Sarah choked out, tears instantly streaming down her face, mixing with the dust. You remember. Apollo rubbed his massive head against hers, his rough tongue like wet sandpaper scraping against her cheek. He was frantic, almost desperate, checking her scent, nuzzling her hair, his tail swishing violently behind him. The aggression of the charge had evaporated instantly, replaced by an explosion of affection that was almost puppy-like in its clumsiness, yet terrifying in its power. David stood by the open door of the Land Rover, his mouth slightly open, the rifle forgotten on the seat. He had worked in conservation for 20 years. He had seen elephants mourn their dead and wild dogs care for their sick, but he had never seen a wild king dismantle his own instincts so completely for a human. He's purring, David whispered, though the sound was loud enough to be heard over the wind. Sarah buried her hands in Apollo's thick, dark mane. It was coarser now, matted with burrs and smelling of wild sage and dust. He wasn't the soft, milk-smelling cub anymore. He smelled like the land. He felt like raw power. Under her fingers she could feel the thick cords of muscle, the scar tissue on his flank, the beating of a heart that had survived droughts and wars. Apollo dropped to all fours but didn't retreat. He circled her, rubbing his entire flank against her legs, nearly knocking her over again, chuffing softly. He looked up at her, those amber eyes clear and bright. The killer was gone. The boy was back. "I thought I lost you," Sarah whispered, kneeling down in the dirt to be at his level. Apollo immediately flopped onto his side, exposing his belly, the ultimate sign of trust from a predator to another being. He swiped the air with a massive paw, catching Sarah's hand and pulling it toward his chest. David walked slowly toward them, keeping a respectful distance. He looked at the lion, then at Sarah. "I told you that once they go wild, they never come back," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have never been so happy to be wrong." The sun began to dip below the jagged horizon of the Ghostlands, painting the sky in bruised purples and burnt oranges. The temperature dropped, and the sounds of the night began to wake up, the chirp of crickets, the distant laugh of a hyena. "We have to go, Sarah," David said softly. "It's not safe to be out of the vehicle at night, even with him." Sarah knew he was right. She spent one last moment buried in Apollo's fur, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. She whispered a final goodbye, not of sadness, but of gratitude. She wasn't leaving him behind. She was leaving him where he belonged. She stood up and backed away slowly. Apollo didn't try to follow. He sat on his haunches, his tail wrapped around his paws, watching her with a regal, calm intensity. He understood. This was his kingdom now, and he had duties that didn't involve sleeping on a mat in a cabin. As Sarah climbed into the Land Rover and David started the engine, Apollo stood up. He threw his head back and let out a roar that shook the windows of the car. It wasn't a roar of aggression, nor was it a cry for help. It was a proclamation, a sound that told every living thing in the valley that the king was alive, he was strong, and he was loved. As they drove away, Sarah watched him in the side mirror until he was just a silhouette against the dying light. "He's not alone anymore," Sarah said, wiping the dust from her face, a smile touching her lips. "No," David agreed, steering them back toward the safety of the camp. "And neither are you." The bond hadn't been broken by time or distance. It had simply evolved. Apollo was no longer her baby to protect. He was a wild force of nature. But in that wildness, he had kept a piece of his heart tame, just for her.